Okay, sorry for the delay. Okay, let's get started. Right, Bob? You good on that? Okay, I see you nodding your head. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Saturday night LaRouche PAC discussion. My name is Mihua Steger, and I am joined tonight by Robert Ingram, who, as many people know, is an author of many books on American history, on the true history of the United States. He's discussed that many times in this forum. And this is a continuation of a series, Rediscovering the Soul of America. And the title of this presentation is George Washington as Military Leader Today. As today, in terms of today, it really does mark less than 90 days to the midterm elections. And what a week it's been. This has been a completely wild week. It started with the raid of President Trump's home, Mar-a-Lago. And certainly that set off major firestorms around the country, across the board. And what it really indicates, with many other things, the failed attempt at J6, the witness, the star witness that they had to bring in, somebody like Cassidy Hutchinson, who really didn't have much to say except for hearsay. So what all of these things indicate, and this raid is just another massive example of that, is the permanent bureaucracy, something that Lyndon LaRouche identified in the 1990s. It's actually posted on our website, a 1.5-minute video of Mr. LaRouche with the foresight of exposing this crazy, out of control Justice Department and what he coined the permanent bureaucracy. Many people probably think of that as maybe the deep state, other types of conceptions, but this is now being picked up by many people and discussed, because we're winning major battles. You've seen this in Arizona, Michigan, Washington, these primaries that have been nail biters to the very end. And what's happened is the voice of the people has triumphed in and over this permanent bureaucracy, this globalist bureaucracy. People, the citizens of this country do not want this permanent bureaucracy. In fact, the citizens of this country want to become a part of eradicating the stronghold and the control of this permanent bureaucracy. And they're arming themselves with the ideas and the tools necessary to be able to really move forward and develop this nation, bring back a quality of beauty and transfiguration, because that's what we have the power to do. So between now and November, with the midterm elections, everybody that's on this call, everybody that joins us on the Monday discussions, throughout the week on our website, every citizen is getting involved in the capacity that they want to, but at this point, there's got to be that sense of a fire in the belly, a real sense in your gut that you have the power. And I believe these battles that we're winning with these midterm elections are an indication to the population that they are regaining the power in their hands. So what better way than to continue to fortify that with the kinds of ideas that we're going to be discussing tonight. And I think with that, I'm going to leave it to Bob. This may become, according to Bob, this may become a 2-part series, but I will let him speak for himself. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, thanks, Miwa. Hello, everyone. Yeah, we're going to be discussing George Washington tonight. There's a lot you can say about George Washington. His presidency, his role in the creation of the United States Constitution, his relationship with Benjamin Franklin, his relationship with Alexander Hamilton. There's a lot. but I am going to focus on George Washington's military command. And we're going to be discussing a lot of the battles that he fought. Now, this may seem a little narrow for some people, but I don't believe that is the case. I mean, as Miwa just went through, and as I think everyone in this call understands, we are now engaged in a war. It's not a political campaign. It's a war to take this country back and to defeat some of the most treasonous and evil people in the history of the United States. This is going to require courage, leadership, intelligence, judgment. It's going to require all of the facets and features of military command if we are going to win this fight. And that is what we are going to be discussing tonight. Now, this is all going to be in the form of discussing, what you could call history. But, this is not an academic history lesson. This is material, I believe, which has a direct relevance to the fight in which we find ourselves today. Now, I'm going to begin, just to situate this, I'm going to begin by reading an excerpt, a relatively short excerpt, a few paragraphs, from the speech that Donald Trump gave at CPAC on August 6th, because I think as we move into this discussion of Washington, we have to ground this within the political reality of what we're dealing with right now. So that said, I'll just read this for you. Trump said, "We don't have time to wait. Our country is being shot. It's being destroyed. It's something we have to do for the future. The future of our country is at stake. We don't have time to wait years and years. We won't have a country left. We will save our freedom. We will save our children, and we will save our country. But the task will not be easy. Together, we are standing up against some of the most menacing forces, entrenched interests, and vicious opponents of our people and our country that our people and our country has ever seen." Where does it stop? Where does it end? It probably doesn't stop, because despite great outside dangers, our biggest threat remains the sick, sinister, and evil people from within our own country. Never forget, everything this corrupt establishment is doing to me is all about preserving their power and control over the American people. But no matter how big or powerful the corrupt radicals we are fighting against may be, no matter how menacing they appear, we must never forget that this nation does not belong to them. This nation belongs to you. This is your home. This is your heritage. This is your country that your American ancestors won with their own courage, defended with their own blood, and built with their own hands. We are going to keep on working. We are going to keep on fighting. We are going to keep on winning. And we are going to get our country back. As long as we cannot lose our spirit, our movement will never be defeated. So I think that situates the proper framework for this discussion and the proper mindset that each of us has to put ourselves in day by day, day in and day out, as we move toward the midterm elections. This election coming up in November is probably the most important midterm election in the history of the United States, because it is going to determine whether or not, on the one hand, whether or not we can stop the Biden regime and the Biden's controllers from doing any further damage to our nation. But even perhaps more important, it is going to determine whether or not we are going to be able to put Donald Trump back in the White House in 2024. So this is a critical battle. It is only a couple of months off. And everything we do in the days and weeks ahead has to be aimed towards achieving victory in that fight. And I think that's a military way of looking at what we're engaged in. And I think we have to have that kind of approach in everything that we do in as we move forward. So those introductory remarks said, I'm going to move directly into Washington. And as I said, this is all going to be about his military leadership, his military campaigns. And as Miwa stated, it is unlikely. We'll see how it goes. But I believe it is unlikely we're going to get through all of it tonight. It may have to be concluded next week. And then, there's the possibility that in the weeks ahead, more could be said about Washington, either in the form of classes like this one, or articles on the LaRouche PAC website, or maybe some other things. But we'll see how that goes. So before just getting into the chronology of the story, I want to mention two absolutely slanderous myths, and we'll deal with these in more detail as we move along, but two slanderous myths about Washington's military leadership in the Revolutionary War. And, these have become particularly prevalent now, almost universal, but they become particularly prevalent since the 1960s. If you go back to the 19th century, people who wrote about Washington, there's a quality almost of reverence in what they wrote. And that really continued into, the 20th century to a large degree, of Washington perceived, not in some sort of, snide way, but in a really a very real sense, Washington perceived and portrayed as the father of our nation. That all began to change in the 1960s. And, and now, when people talk about Washington's military leadership, the first thing you hear, and it's almost accepted by everyone, is that Washington was a very poor general who lost almost all of the battles that he fought. Now, that is completely untrue. I mean, completely untrue. And secondly, that really, it wasn't Washington who won the Revolutionary War. It was the French who came in and saved us. And it was really the French who defeated the British, and not Washington's army. And that's completely untrue as well. And I just want to mention these right now, because we'll get into the details of both of those a little bit later. But on this question of, this slander of Washington, that he was a poor general, that he lost all of his battles. I mean, you see this now. I'm sure people have heard this. and you see it repeated over and over again in things that people write now. It's kind of, well, I'll give you a couple of quotes, from these. I've read a lot of books about Washington, a lot of books about Washington. And, you know, in, in some of the more recent books, say books published in the last 20 years or so, you get this litany where people just keep repeating the same phrases. For instance, and these are direct quotes I'm giving you. One historian that I read said, quote, "In the New York campaign, the Americans had been outmanned, outgunned, and outgeneraled at every turn." Another historian said, "Washington split his forces between Long Island and Manhattan, a critical mistake, and as a result, his army was outnumbered, outgunned, and outgeneraled." So they even use the same phrases. It's like, January 6th was an insurrection. You just keep, if you have everybody in the news media calling it an insurrection, this then becomes, what people say it is. And these guys are so incompetent, they actually even, plagiarize from each other the same phrases about Washington. And then yet another historian who said, "Washington placed half his force on Long Island to defend Brooklyn, and in doing so made the fundamental error of cutting his army in two." So one person called it the fundamental error, another person called it the critical mistake, which is really not true at all. But this is what they have to say. And then you have, this sort of trendy historian now, one that's popular at the moment. These people are like the flavor of the month. They get a couple of New York Times bestsellers, and they're like, they're the historian who everyone quotes. So you've got this guy now, Ron Chernow, who wrote these biographies of Hamilton and Ulysses S. Grant, which are not good biographies. They're actually very poor biographies. But what he said about Washington is he said that Washington misguidedly concentrated upon New York, while his French allies masterminded the decisive blow at Yorktown. Now, this is just either unbelievable incompetence or an outright lie. This is not a word of truth in what he writes there. That's Ron Chernow. So this is what you get right now. This is the kind of stuff that people have to say. Now, it is true that up until Yorktown, at Yorktown, the Allied American and French forces outnumbered Cornwallis. But up until Yorktown, for the first 6 years of the war, the Continental Army, Washington's army, was at every battle outmanned and outgunned. At every battle. They were not outgeneraled. So I want to give you a sense of what they were up against. Now, I'm not going to begin at the beginning. I'm not going to begin with Lexington and Concord or the siege of Boston. I'm going to get back to Boston. But I want to, after the British evacuated Boston, they went to Halifax, and they prepared then over a period of time for the full invasion of the colonies, which was going to be an invasion of New York City. And I want to give you a sense of what Washington had to confront on the battlefield. So we're talking here about 1776, the summer of 1776. This is prior to the Declaration of Independence. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from my notes. On June 29th, 1776, the first British ships arrived in New York Harbor. Within 2 days, there were 48 ships carrying over 10,000 British troops, along with General William Howe, the commander. That was only the beginning, however. On July 12th, Admiral Richard Howe arrived with an even larger fleet of 82 ships carrying thousands of more soldiers. Then on August 12th, a third fleet arrived carrying thousands of Hessian soldiers. Then on August 15th, a fourth fleet arrived, carrying General Cornwallis and thousands of more troops. By the middle of August, combined in New York Harbor, and they began to move the troops almost immediately into encampments on Staten Island. But by the middle of August, in New York Harbor and on Staten Island, there were 34,000 British and Hessian troops, as well as 10,000 British sailors, 44,000 altogether, which was a larger military force than the largest city in the colonies. There were 30 warships, that is full warships, 30 warships, and over 400 other ships, frigates and transport ships and what have you. Some people say there were as many as 700 ships, but there were at least 400 to 500 ships total. This was the largest British invasion force ever to be assembled in British history. It was the largest amphibious assault force in European history up to that point. But up to that point, the largest invasion force in European history up to that point. It was 4 times larger than the Spanish Armada. So this is what Washington was confronted with in New York. This was the full military and naval force of the British Empire, which attacked New York City. And Washington was there with 9,000 men. 9,000 men. Poorly equipped, very little artillery, very little in the way of armament. And these were men, almost none of whom had been militarily trained, the American forces, while the British troops contained within them elite units, infantry and other units, the cream of the crop of the British fighting forces. So that's what Washington was dealing with. That's what he had to confront. And, you know, when you get these people who say Washington made mistakes in defending New York City, I mean, you have got to be kidding me. You know, when the British landed in Brooklyn, they landed with 22,000 men. That was their initial landing force, and they had reinforcements. You had British warships patrolling the East River and the North River. You know, there was no possible way that Washington could defeat these forces. No possible way. Now you could say, why didn't he just retreat? Why didn't he just abandon the city? Congress abandoned the city. They left, you know. the New York State Congress. They fled upstate, which was not really the wrong thing to do. But why didn't Washington just leave? Well, imagine that. If at the first sign of a British invasion, you flee, what would have been the effect of that on morale, on the colonies, on how America was perceived in Europe? Washington knew that if the revolution was going to continue, he had to stand and fight. There was no other way. He had to stand and fight. But there was no possible way he could win that fight. Now, you get some people who say, well, what he should have done, this thing of he made this critical mistake of dividing his forces, with putting some of his forces in Manhattan and some of his forces in Brooklyn. Well, what should he have done? If he had put all of his forces in Manhattan, the British could have occupied Brooklyn without a fight, and you would have had British warships surrounding Manhattan, bombarding it at will, and they had no defense against that. I mean, at one point, there's this, true story. It's a true story where there was a British warship sailing up the Hudson, I think it was. It might have been the East River, but I think it was the Hudson, lower Manhattan. And Alexander Hamilton had an artillery, position there. He had one or two cannons. And, he had his little group of volunteers. They were all in, sort of militiamen, so to speak. This is before he joined Washington's staff. And, Hamilton's like 19 or 20 years old. And he says, we're going to stand and fight, And the British warship sails up and unleashes a bombardment on Hamilton's position, destroys the cannons, destroys all the works, and Hamilton and his friends barely escape with their lives. You're not gonna occupy Manhattan and defend it against 30 British warships. So you could say, well, why didn't he put all of his forces in Brooklyn? Well, he still would have been outnumbered by Howe. And plus, what's he going to do from Brooklyn? If he's in Brooklyn and the British occupy Manhattan without a fight and then surround Washington's positions in Brooklyn with British warships, where's he going to go? I mean, where are you going to go if you can't go into Manhattan? If you can't escape? You're trapped. So all these armchair military strategists, they don't know what they're talking about. What Washington did was he took a stand in Brooklyn while maintaining his forces in Manhattan and giving him an avenue through which he could escape if they lost the battle in Brooklyn. And, and it took the British, a week to overcome Washington's forces in Brooklyn. It was a very fierce fighting. It was the outcome was sort of a foregone conclusion, but Washington took his positions and defended them fiercely. And you see him do that again and again and again throughout the Revolutionary War. Before I move on, to discuss any more of the campaigns, I just want to briefly deal with this question of, how this myth that we were saved by France in the Revolutionary War. Now, it is the case that we received two extremely important types of aid from France during the Revolutionary War. One was the arms that they sent over, beginning in as early as 1775, 1776, before the Treaty of Alliance was signed. The Treaty of Alliance was not signed until 1778. But most of those arms that we received in 75 and 76, in fact, almost all those arms, really, did not come from the French government. They were obtained through private sources. And this was the work of Silas Deane, primarily, working with people like Beaumarchais and others, who surreptitiously and illegally managed to get substantial amounts of arms shipped to the Continental Army, which were, played an important role in some of the battles that were fought. So that is true. The arms were of great importance, although until 1778, almost none of that came, or very little of it came from the French government. Then there was the financial aid, which particularly came in after the signing of the Treaty of Alliance, the French loans and what have you. And that was primarily the work of Benjamin Franklin. But on the question of French military aid, not arms, but military aid, this is largely a myth, and I mean that explicitly. I'm not going to back down from that. The French provided, up until Yorktown, the French provided almost no military assistance. Now, be aware, the Treaty of Alliance, which was a military alliance, was signed in 1778. Yorktown was in the latter part of 1781. So the military alliance was in effect for 3.5 years before Yorktown. And during that 3.5 years, the French did almost nothing militarily in the 13 colonies, almost nothing. I mean, they did a couple of things. In 1778, they agreed to a joint U.S.-French attack on Newport, Rhode Island, which the British were holding. And the Americans landed the troops there, and the Americans took up their positions to attack the British. The French fleet sailed in. The French, under Admiral d'Estaing, they were supposed to land troops, but then they decided not to. And they didn't land their troops, and the French fleet sailed back to Boston. What then happened was that the British attacked the American troops who were still there. The French did not evacuate the American troops. And many of the American troops were slaughtered, and others escaped with their lives. They had to run away because the French had sailed away. The next year, the same Admiral d'Estaing launched agreed for a joint attack on Savannah, Georgia, another city that the British were holding. And he sailed his fleet down there, and the French carried out a bombardment, which was completely ineffective. And then the Americans tried to storm Savannah, which they failed in doing, and the French sailed away. And that was about it. That was about it. In 1780, 6,000 French soldiers under Rochambeau were landed in Rhode Island in 1780. But they sat in Rhode Island for a year, from 1780 to 1781, for 12 months, and didn't do anything, didn't engage in any fighting whatsoever. Meanwhile, Washington is fighting battle after battle after battle after battle after battle. And, it was not until Yorktown that the French played a significant role. But they by no means won the Battle of Yorktown. Their role was indispensable, but they did not win the battle. So this idea that, we couldn't have won the revolution without the French, that the French won the revolution for us. None of this is true. It's just not true. So we'll get into some of that. Now, I said I was not going to get through all of this tonight, and it seems to me I'm already running behind. So what I'm going to do, just one second here. I was going to start with Boston, but I think I'm going to skip over Boston because there are some key battles I want to make sure I get to. So you had Boston, which Washington brought the cannon in from Fort Ticonderoga. The siege of Boston lasted a year, and the troops in Boston, the British troops outnumbered the Americans the whole time. But Washington had them under siege. The siege lasted a year, but there was no way to dislodge them without artillery. And it was Washington who sent Henry Knox to Fort Ticonderoga to get the cannon at Fort Ticonderoga. Knox didn't just go on his own. Knox was in Washington's camp in Cambridge, and Washington sent him to Ticonderoga. And they brought the cannon back, and they launched a bombardment on Boston on March 4th, and 11 days later, the British withdrew, and most of them sailed up to Halifax to regroup. And then in the summer and late summer of, as I said, of 1776, they attacked Brooklyn and eventually drove Washington off of Brooklyn. So Washington retreated. I'm not going to go through all the details. People know it was foggy night. They crossed the East River, but he retreated into Manhattan, and he moved his troops up to Harlem Heights, most of his troops, and he built an entrenched position there. This is in sort of the northern part of Manhattan. Howe followed him. Howe's army immediately moved across the East River into Manhattan. They landed at a place called Kips Bay, which is where the United Nations is right now. And Washington deployed some of his troops to try to stop them, and he went there personally. And the idea was, like at D-Day, stop them at the beaches. They tried to prevent Howe from landing, but they couldn't do it. So he moved everyone back to Harlem Heights, entrenched there, and didn't go any further, and basically dared the British to attack him. What happened was that on September 16th, the full British army attacked Washington at Harlem Heights. And the battle lasted all day. At the end of the day, not only had the British not broken through, but Washington's army had pushed the British back 1 mile. So in a direct head-to-head battle, they had actually pushed the British back 1 mile. He had demonstrated that in a face-to-face battle, the British were not invincible, that the British could be beaten back. And then they stood there for 4 weeks with 4 weeks, almost a month, with Howe's army, Washington's army facing each other in Upper Manhattan, in Harlem Heights. And Howe would not attack him again. He would not attack him again. Finally, at the end of 4 weeks, Howe sent an expeditionary force up to the Bronx, what's called Throg's Neck in the Bronx, to try to land forces so he could attack Washington from the rear. And Washington deployed some of his troops to Throg's Neck, and they defeated the British landing force and drove them back into the boats. And they left. So then, about a week later, Howe tried again to land, and he landed for a landing force even further away, further up into the Bronx, north of Throg's Neck, where he did succeed a landing force. Once Washington heard of that, he immediately moved his troops off of Manhattan into the Bronx and marched north into Westchester, avoiding the trap. He marched up to White Plains, and he established a fortified position in White Plains. Now, these are battles which are normally glossed over when you read about the American Revolution. You know, you read about, Battle of Saratoga, Battle of Yorktown, but these are critical battles at the opening part of the war. Remember what I said. The invasion force of New York was the largest British invasion force in history. They were there to crush the revolution, to obliterate Washington's army. And Washington is fighting a series of battles. And at Harlem Heights, the American lines held, and they drove the British back. So then he moves up to Westchester, and he establishes fortified positions at White Plains. Howe moves his entire army up there and attacks Washington at White Plains. And the Americans don't retreat, and they fight back. And the battle lasted all day. And at the end of the day, they were back where they were at the beginning. Neither army had gained any ground. It was a draw. The British had forced the army, fought the British army to a standstill. So what Howe told his generals, and this is confirmed by firsthand accounts, is at night he called off the attack and said, "We will go after them in the morning. We will finish them off in the morning." And it's confirmed that he said that. And when the morning broke and Howe went out to review the American positions and the American line of battle, he called off the attack, and he didn't attack. They stood there for 2 days, at which point Washington moved a little bit further north to a place called North Castle, where he dug in again. Howe marched up to look at Washington's positions in North Castle and withdrew, refused to attack Washington. And it was only at that point that Washington moved his troops across the Hudson to begin, the movement down through New Jersey. He was not chased out of New York. He had, if anything, he had defeated, although he had certainly not driven them from the field, he had defeated the British at Harlem. He had fought them to a draw at White Plains. The British were refusing to attack him, and and that was, that's what occurred. He made the decision to withdraw across New Jersey because he certainly knew he could not go on the offensive and retake New York City. He had a few thousand soldiers, poorly equipped, poorly trained, very little artillery. against the whole British Empire. And there was no way he was about to retake New York City. Plus, the British Navy at any moment could sail up the Hudson River, cut off his retreat, and Howe's army could also receive substantial reinforcements. So he had no choice but to withdraw. So as everyone knows, he withdrew down the Hudson. He withdrew down through New Jersey. He paused for a while at Brunswick, but then he continued until all the way down to where he crossed the Delaware. That's where they stood by December of 1776. So, then what came was, as people know, the Battle of Trenton. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the Battle of Trenton because everyone knows about it. Everyone knows what happened there. On Christmas Day evening, they crossed at night. They surprised the Hessians. They defeated them. They took 1,000 prisoners, right? But what is truly remarkable, historic, is what came next. Not what happened at Trenton, but what came next. Because after the Battle of Trenton, Washington withdrew his troops back across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. This was like a hit and run, attack. They went over there, they defeated the Hessians, they took 1,000 prisoners, and they got back in their boats and they went back to Pennsylvania, right? And Cornwallis, who had been sent there by Howe, he was a junior general to Howe at that time. Cornwallis, who was in, I think, Brunswick, learning of what had happened at Trenton, marched his army down to Trenton from Brunswick. So here you are a couple of days after Christmas, and Washington is in Pennsylvania. Cornwallis is in Trenton. What does Washington do? He crosses the Delaware again, and he attacks Howe's army. This is not a few drunken Hessians, on Christmas Day. He launches a direct attack on Clinton's army. This is the second crossing of the Delaware. And they fight the British to a standstill. This is not the British attacking Washington. This is Washington attacking the British. And he fights them to a standstill. Then he does something absolutely brilliant, which is while they're sitting there confronting each other, just outside of Trenton, at a place called, I don't have it. I'm not going to bother looking for it. It's the name of a creek. The two armies are sitting there. In the middle of the night, Washington evacuates all of his troops, marches around the British army, gets in their rear, and marches to Princeton and defeats the British army at Princeton. Now, people say this was clever and what have you. This is one of the most brilliant political maneuvers in history. If you think of what Douglas MacArthur did in Korea at Incheon, it has a similar flavor to it. But what Washington did was a far, far more powerful strategic flanking attack. In fact, years after the Revolution, in letters that were exchanged between Cornwallis and Washington, Cornwallis wrote to Washington that the attack on Princeton was one of the most surprising and brilliant in the history of warfare. And Frederick the Great wrote a letter to Washington in which he said that Washington's attack at Princeton ranked Washington among the greatest generals of all time. See, because what the British were intending to do, first with Howe, and then with Clinton, is they were intending to march through New Jersey to take Pennsylvania. So this is not simply a battlefield tactical maneuver. Washington is thinking strategically all the time, all the time. And one of the things I didn't go into, and I'm probably not going to go into it, I have notes on it, was that during the siege of Boston, it was during the siege of Boston, this is, before the Declaration of Independence, it was Washington who put together the plan to invade Canada, which almost succeeded. They came very close to carrying that off. Washington is never just thinking in terms of the battlefield right in front of him. The immediate tactical battle. He is thinking of winning the war. Now, what Howe had intended and what Cornwallis had intended was to march through New Jersey, crush Washington, and then march on to Philadelphia. What Washington did in Princeton is he destroyed that. Because by getting in the rear of Cornwallis's army and attacking it from the rear and attacking his supply lines, he forced Cornwallis to pull all of his army back to Brunswick. And ultimately, Cornwallis withdrew all of his army into New York City, back to New York City. This meant that any chance for marching to Philadelphia was stopped. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, the significance of it was that Washington was well aware. They had, communications. Washington had, a very extensive espionage operation going on, which is a whole nother discussion. Washington knew that they were planning a three-pronged attack to separate the colonies. That Burgoyne was going to march down from Montreal, or excuse me, from Quebec anyway. That St. Leger was going to march over from Lake Ontario, and that the British were supposed to march up from New York City, and they were all going to join forces, essentially establish total British domination over the Hudson River Valley, from Canada to New York. Total British domination, cutting off New England, cutting off the Hudson River, et cetera, et cetera. Washington knew that that was the plan. But he also knew that the British military commanders were intent on capturing Philadelphia, which was the capital of the revolution. It's where the Congress was sitting. And by Washington, what the Battle of Princeton did was it cut off any chance of the British taking Philadelphia by land. And it left the British military leadership in New York City with a choice. They could either march, they could either go north to join Burgoyne, or they could launch an invasion of Philadelphia by sea. And Washington knew that if they made the decision to launch a naval invasion of Philadelphia with hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of troops, if they were to do that, that Burgoyne could be defeated. And that's what the Battle of Princeton made possible. And in fact, when Washington learned that the British troops had embarked on July 23rd, when he learned that the British troops had embarked from Staten Island to sail to Philadelphia, he said he told one of his aides, he said, "Now let all New England turn out and crush Burgoyne." And he stated repeatedly at that point that he was certain of the defeat of Burgoyne based on the one of my lights just went out. Well, we'll do the best we can. That we could crush. He was certain that Burgoyne would be defeated once the British had made the decision to move on Philadelphia in that way. So, he attacked at Trenton twice. He attacked at Princeton. He built fortifications at Harlem Heights and dared the full British Army to attack him. He built fortifications at White Plains and dared the full British Army to attack him. This is not a guy, who spent years running away from the British, or carrying out little skirmishes around the British, waiting for, the decisive battle. This is not what he was doing at all. And the entire time, his mind, and this is not me sort of reading into it, it's very clear. His mind is on the full strategic picture, the full strategic battleground. He never fights a fight that he never engages in a battle which is not in some way going to contribute towards strategic victory. Now, I had hoped to get through at least the battles of Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth, but I tell you, it's already 5 o'clock. I had when I said I'm going to cut this into 2 parts, where I had made the decision to cut it, it's still, I'm not even close to that. So I don't know, I don't want to go into Brandywine because then I have to go into Germantown. And so that would just drag this out till 5:20 or 5:30. There is one thing I want to do before I stop,
okay.
Which is again, I described to you the military invasion force which the British had brought into New York Harbor. And there's Washington with his 9,000 men, sitting at that point. They hadn't yet deployed to their full positions in Brooklyn. He's sitting with his army in Lower Manhattan. They could see the British warships in the harbor, hundreds and hundreds of them. They could see them there. And on July 2nd, Washington issued a message to his troops. He said, "The time is now near at hand, which must probably determine whether Americans are to be consigned to a state of wretchedness from which no human efforts will probably deliver them. The fate of unborn millions will now depend, under God, on the courage and brave resistance or the most abject submission. This is all that we can expect. We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die." So that was a message he sent out to every division, brigade, every command, in the Continental Army in Manhattan on July 2nd, while the British invasion force is assembling itself in the harbor. And then 6 days later, on July 8th, Washington received in a packet from Philadelphia the Declaration of Independence, which had just been signed. And on the very next morning, on July 9th, he assembled all of the troops, as well as thousands and thousands of civilians in lower Manhattan. And he had the full Declaration of Independence read out loud to all the people who were assembled there. And from that point, the troops redeployed themselves into their battle positions in Brooklyn and elsewhere. So that's that's the beginning of the story of who Washington was as a general. I'm only up to Princeton. So hopefully, if people think they're getting something out of this, we can continue it next week. But I think I will stop right there.